The morning Martha Bailey stood at her dead husband's grave, the sky above Caldwell, Kansas was the color of a bruise, and she felt nothing she had expected to feel. She had dressed in her black mourning clothes before dawn, had pinned her dark auburn hair beneath the veil her mother-in-law had sent from St. Louis, and had walked the half-mile from the edge of town to the little fenced cemetery on the hill where the cottonwood trees grew sparse and the wind never quite stopped. She had walked alone. That was the thing people would talk about later. The women at the dry goods store and the men leaning outside the saloon. That Martha Bailey had walked to bury her husband all alone, without a single soul beside her, and that she had stood at the grave with her chin lifted and her hands folded and had not wept even once. What they did not know, and what Martha had no intention of telling anyone in the town of Caldwell in the year of our Lord 1882, was that she was not weeping because the grief she felt was not the clean, simple kind. It was the tangled sort. The kind that comes when a person has spent 3 years loving someone who spent those same 3 years making certain that love cost her everything she had. The marker was plain pine. She had not ordered the stone one yet because she had not decided whether she would stay in Caldwell long enough to justify the expense. The grave had been dug by hired men, and the service had been performed by Reverend Haskins, with a brevity that told Martha the Reverend knew more about Eli Bailey than he was willing to say aloud in the presence of a widow. Eli Bailey had come to her when she was 23 and full of a hope that frontier life had not yet fully stripped from her. He had been handsome in the lean, sunburned way of men who spent their days outdoors, and he had promised her a homestead, a future, a partnership. He had delivered none of those things. What he had delivered instead were debts she did not know existed, a farmstead mortgage 3 times over to a man named Harlan Dodd who ran the cattlemen's bank with the cheerful cruelty of someone who understood that the law in Caldwell bent toward whoever held the most paper. Eli had gambled. Eli had borrowed. Eli had signed her name to documents she had never seen, using the proxy authority of marriage as a weapon, and by the time she had understood the full shape of what he had done, the land was as good as gone and Eli himself was dead of a fever that had taken him in 4 days, leaving her with nothing but the debt, a half-empty farmhouse 6 miles from town, and the particular loneliness of mourning a man whose absence was, in some shameful corner of her heart, a relief. She had known, standing there over the raw earth, that she had perhaps 2 months before Harlan Dodd's men came to collect on the note. She was 26 years old. She had $43 in the tin box beneath the floorboards. She had a horse named Clem who was aging but reliable, and she had the dress she was standing in and 5 others hanging in the wardrobe at the farmhouse. That was the sum total of her life after 3 years of marriage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. She was so deep in that particular arithmetic of despair that she did not hear the footsteps until they were close. The heavy, deliberate crunch of boot leather on the dry grass behind her. She turned, her hand going instinctively to the small derringer she kept in the pocket of her morning dress, a habit she had developed in the 2nd year of her marriage when Eli's creditors had begun appearing at unexpected hours. The man who stood 5 feet behind her was tall, perhaps 6 feet and a little more, with the kind of frame that came from years of hard physical work. He wore a trail-worn canvas duster, the color of old wheat, over a chambray shirt. His hat was a broad-brimmed Stetson that had been dark once and had gone to a weathered gray. He had a face that was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 32, angular and brown from the sun, with dark eyes that held in them a quality she could not immediately name, not pity, not curiosity, but something closer to the expression of a man who has traveled a long way to do something he is not sure he deserves to do. He held his hat in both hands in front of him. He had taken it off, she realized, when he came through the cemetery gate. "Mrs. Bailey," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice accustomed to open spaces. "My name is Arthur Whitfield. I expect you don't know me." Martha's hand stayed near the derringer. "I do not," she said. and I am not in the habit of receiving strangers at my husband's grave." "No, ma'am, I understand that." He did not move closer. He stood with his hat in his hands and let her look at him, which she appreciated in a way she was not ready to articulate. Most men, in her experience, moved toward things they wanted without waiting to see if the other party was ready to receive them. This one waited. "Then why are you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and the wind moved through the cottonwood branches above them with a dry, papery sound. Down below in the town, a church bell was ringing the hour, 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning in April. "Because I owe you something," Arthur Whitfield said, "and I came to make it right." Martha stared at him. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. She had half expected him to be another creditor, or one of Harlan Dodd's men sent to assess her circumstances. She had expected officialdom or opportunism or both. She had not expected a man standing in a cemetery in the early morning light, turning his hat in his hands and talking about debts. "You had better explain that," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Arthur said. "I will, but I'd ask if we might walk a little. I find it easier to speak plainly when I'm moving." She considered him for a long moment. He was armed. She could see the gun belt at his hip, but his hand was nowhere near it. He looked like a man who was nervous, which was not the look of a man who intended harm. She released her hold on the derringer. "Walk then," she said, "but speak quickly. I have things to do." They walked along the inside of the cemetery fence, the grass still wet with the early dew, and Arthur Whitfield began to talk. He had a particular way of telling a story. She noticed no embellishment, no apology wrapped inside the words, just the facts in the order in which they had occurred, and she found herself listening with a focus she had not expected to bring to anything that morning. He had known Eli Bailey, he said, not well but well enough. They had crossed paths 3 years back, just before Eli came to Caldwell, during a cattle drive-up from Texas along the Kishom Trail. Eli had been working as a drover, and Arthur had been ramrodding a smaller outfit, 40 head belonging to a rancher named Culpepper out of San Antonio. They had shared a camp for 2 nights at a river crossing in Indian Territory, and during those 2 nights Eli had borrowed $30 from a drover in Arthur's crew, a young man named Samuel Greer, and had not paid it back. Samuel Greer, Arthur said, looking straight ahead as they walked, had been Arthur's younger cousin. Samuel had been 19 on his first drive, and he had lent the money because he was 19 and trusted people, and did not yet know better. When the drive ended and Eli disappeared north toward Kansas, Samuel had written the $30 off as a lesson. He had gone on to work cattle for 2 more seasons, and then had taken a job with a small ranch in the Texas Hill Country, and married a girl named Petra in the autumn of 1880 and was doing well, all things considered, except that he had never forgotten the money and had never quite believed that a man who stole from a boy deserved to simply walk away clean. Martha stopped walking. "Your cousin sent you here," she said. "For $30. "No, ma'am," Arthur said, and now he did look at her, and that quality in his dark eyes resolved itself into something she could name. It was seriousness, a complete and uncomplicated seriousness. "Samuel doesn't know I'm here, and it isn't about $30. It's about the fact that I was the ramrod on that drive. It was my job to know what was happening in my camp. I should have known Eli Bailey was the kind of man who borrowed and disappeared. I didn't. And I've carried that since, because Samuel was my responsibility, and I let him be taken advantage of. When I heard through the cattle circuit, word travels, when I heard that Eli Bailey had died in Caldwell and left a widow in a bad situation, I figured the debt had compounded enough that $30 and an apology weren't going to cover it." Martha looked at him for a long time. The wind moved the veil at her cheek. The sun was beginning to clear the horizon in earnest now, painting the cemetery grass in that particular shade of gold that only existed for about 10 minutes each morning before the light went flat. "Mr. Whitfield," she said slowly, Are you telling me you came all the way to Caldwell, Kansas, to a dead man's grave, to pay a widow the $30 her husband stole from your cousin 3 years ago, and to apologize for something that was not entirely your fault to begin with?" He thought about it. "More or less," he said. "Though I'd also like to hear the full shape of the situation you're in, if you're willing to share it. Because the things I'm hearing suggest that $30 won't scratch the surface, and I have more than $30. She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it surprised her, because she had not laughed in a very long time, and it came out a little rough and uneven. But it was a real laugh, not a polite one. "It certainly will not scratch the surface," she said. "I am $740 in debt to Harlan Dodd at the Cattlemen's Bank. I have a farmstead with a triple mortgage note. I have a horse and $43 of my own money. And I have approximately 2 months before Dodd's men arrive to collect on the note and take the property." Arthur Whitfield nodded slowly, as though she were giving him survey information rather than the ruins of her life. "And what is the property worth?" he asked. "The land is good," she said, and the saying of it brought something sharp into her throat because it was true, and it was a particular cruelty that the land was good. The 60 acres she and Eli had nominally worked were rich in the way of Kansas bottomland, with 2 reliable springs and good grass and soil that turned dark when you turned it. 60 acres of bottom land with water, a cabin, a barn, a smokehouse. If it were free and clear, it would be worth $1,200, possibly $15. But it is not free and clear, it is very much the opposite. And Dodd holds the notes. Dodd holds the notes, she confirmed. They had come full circle around the cemetery's interior path and stood now back at Eli's grave. Martha looked down at the plain pine marker, at the raw mounded earth. She thought about the fact that she was standing here having a business conversation with a stranger while her husband's body was barely cold beneath the ground, and she felt a brief flash of guilt that dissolved almost immediately in the pragmatic light of her circumstances. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He put his hat back on his head and looked at her with that level, serious gaze. "I'd like to look at the notes if you have copies. I'd like to have a conversation with Harlan Dodd. And then I'd like to make an offer on the property that is fair, not for speculation but for settlement so that Dodd is paid, the notes are cleared, and you have your land back free and clear with something left over." The world was entirely quiet for a moment except for the wind and the distant sound of the town beginning its day. "Why," Martha said. It was the only word that mattered. Arthur Whitfield was quiet for a beat. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "And because I am 31 years old and I have spent a long time doing the profitable thing when I should have been doing the right one. And Samuel's $30 has been at the back of my mind for 3 years like a stone in a boot." He paused. "Also because I came through Caldwell last autumn on a drive, and I saw Eli Bailey in the saloon, drunk and loud, and I saw you come in to collect him. I saw the look on your face. And I thought a thing I probably should not have thought, which was that a woman like that deserves considerably better than what she's got." Martha felt the heat come into her face and was grateful for the veil. She was also, beneath the complexity of everything else she was feeling, aware that she was standing next to a man who was not unattractive, which she considered to be the most untimely observation she had ever made in her entire life. "My husband is freshly buried," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Arthur said, and there was no apology in it but also no impropriety. He was simply acknowledging the fact of it. "I'm not suggesting anything beyond assistance. You can take that assistance or not as you choose. Either way, I'll leave you the $30 Samuel's owed before I go." She thought for a long time. She thought about Harlan Dodd's thin smile. She thought about the farmhouse with the good southern-facing window and the springs that ran clear even in August. She thought about the $43 in the tin box and the 2 months she had before the world fell in. "You'd better come have breakfast," she said finally, "and you can see the notes." The farmhouse was modest and clean in the way of homes kept by women who take pride in small things. Arthur Whitfield stepped inside and removed his hat without being asked, and looked around at the whitewashed walls and the calico curtains and the cast-iron stove and the herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beams, and said nothing, but looked at it all with the careful attention of a man assessing something of genuine worth. Martha put the coffee on and went to the chest in the bedroom and retrieved the tin box. She brought it to the table and opened it and laid out the notes one by one. There were 4 of them: the original mortgage note, a secondary note taken out 2 years later, a third taken out 6 months before Eli's death, and a bill of judgment from the bank's attorney that had arrived by post 3 weeks ago. Arthur sat across from her at the kitchen table and read each one in turn slowly without comment. He had the reading habits of a man who had taught himself to read as an adult, careful and complete, leaving nothing unexamined. The coffee was ready by the time he finished. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across from him. "He signed your name," Arthur said. He touched the 3rd note. "This one, you see the signature." "I see it," Martha said. "It is not my signature. I have been aware of that for some time." "That's fraud," Arthur said, and his voice did not change its tone, did not become angry, simply stated the legal fact the way a doctor might state a diagnosis. "That note may not be enforceable." Martha wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "And who in Caldwell is going to hear a case on that question?" she said. "Judge Harwell plays cards with Harlan Dodd every Friday evening. I have no money for a lawyer. I have no family within 300 miles. The legal reality of this situation, Mr. Whitfield, is somewhat different from the legal theory." Arthur nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "What if Dodd were approached by someone with ready cash and an offer on the notes?" he said slowly, before the question of the fraudulent signature became public. "Someone who made it clear that unless he settled at a discount for cash, the matter would be brought before a district judge rather than Judge Harwell." Martha looked at him. "Dodd would not like that." "No," Arthur agreed. "He would not. He would also not like it because he knows the 3rd note is fraudulent," she said. "He accepted it knowing that. Which means he is as exposed as Eli was." Something shifted in Arthur Whitfield's expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, a slight movement at the corner of his mouth that suggested he appreciated the quality of her thinking. "You have given this some thought," he said. "I have had very little else to think about for 3 weeks, she said. They sat with their coffee and the documents between them and the morning light coming through the calico curtains, and they talked. It was the most honest conversation Martha Bailey had experienced in 3 years of marriage, and the recognition of that fact was both heartening and painful. She was not a woman who had lacked for intelligence, for opinions, for the ability to analyze a situation with precision. She was a woman who had been married to a man who had no interest in any of those qualities in her, and so they had gone unused for 3 years. And it was strange and wonderful and a little alarming to discover that they were still entirely present, waiting. Arthur Whitfield, she discovered over that first breakfast and the refilling of cups and the consultation of documents, was a man of considerable substance despite his trail-worn appearance. He had spent 7 years working cattle drives from Texas north to the Kansas railheads, starting as a drover and working up to ramrod, and then to trail boss for a large outfit out of San Antonio. 3 years ago, he had taken his accumulated wages and the small inheritance from his father's estate in central Texas, and had bought a working interest in a small ranch near Wichita. The ranch ran 300 head and was turning a modest profit. He was not wealthy, but he was solvent in a way that was entirely real, and he had approximately $900 in a cashier's draft at the First National Bank in Wichita. "That is more than enough to clear the notes," Martha said, doing the arithmetic quickly in her head. "It is," Arthur said. "If Dodd accepts a settlement at the face value of the honest notes and agrees to set aside the fraudulent one, you'd be clear for $710. If he refuses and wants face value on all 4, it would require $740. Either way, the number is within reach. You would spend $900 to make right a $30 wrong done to your cousin by my dead husband," Martha said. She said it flatly, not as an accusation, simply to hear the shape of the thing. Arthur looked at her steadily across the table. "I would spend it to see those notes cleared and the land put in your name free and clear," he said. "What I spend it for, and why, is my concern." She held his gaze for a long moment. The morning light had shifted and now came in at an angle across the table between them, and she noticed, not for the first time, that his eyes were very dark, a deep brown that in certain light appeared almost black, and that they had a quality of absolute directness that she found, against her better judgment, to be deeply attractive. She looked away. "I will need to think about this," she said. "Of course," Arthur said, and stood and took his cup to the wash basin without being asked, which was another thing she noticed. He went outside to see to his horse, a large bay gelding named Pilgrim that he had tied at the fence post, and Martha sat alone at the kitchen table with the documents in front of her, and thought about what it meant to accept help from a stranger who was not a stranger in the way that most men were strangers. She thought about it for a long time, and by noon she had decided two things. The first was that she would accept the help, not blindly, not without terms, not without a clear accounting of what was given and what was owed, but she would accept it. The second was that Arthur Whitfield was a complication she had not anticipated and was not entirely sure she was ready for, and that she needed to keep a careful distance between his genuinely good qualities and her own very raw and complicated emotional state. She told him the first decision at noon when he came back in from splitting her wood pile, which she had not asked him to do but which she acknowledged needed doing. "I accept," she said, "but I want it documented. A proper loan agreement witnessed in writing. Terms of repayment: I will repay every dollar over time, and I will not accept it as charity." Something in Arthur's face moved. "It was never offered as charity," he said quietly. "It's offered as restitution, but if having it documented makes you more comfortable, then we'll document it." "It is not about comfort," Martha said. "It is about independence. I have been subject to arrangements I did not fully understand for 3 years, and I will not begin another set of them." "Understood," Arthur said, and she believed him. They drove into town that afternoon in Martha's wagon, which was better described as Eli's wagon, which was technically already the bank's wagon, but they drove it anyway. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a busy town, one of the railhead cattle towns that had grown up along the Kishom Trail, still wild in the ways that mattered, a main street with more saloons than churches, a railroad depot at the south end, a stockyard, a proper hotel, a land office, a lawyer's office, a dry goods, and the cattleman's bank, which sat on the corner with its freshly painted sign and its air of institutional permanence. Harlan Dodd was a man of perhaps 50, with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone who had moved from physical to financial labor early and had not looked back. He received Martha with the particular brand of condescending sympathy that men in his position had developed for widows, and he received Arthur Whitfield with a different expression entirely, a measuring one, the look of a man who is very quickly calculating what this stranger means and whether he presents an opportunity or a problem. Arthur said very little during that first meeting. He let Martha present the documents and ask the questions, and he sat beside her with his hat on his knee and watched Harlan Dodd with those dark, patient eyes. And Dodd, who was a man attuned to power in its various forms, grew progressively less comfortable as the meeting went on. They did not resolve anything that first day. Dodd needed time, he said, to review the matter. Arthur said he would be in Caldwell for the week at the hotel and that he would appreciate a response before Friday. On the street outside the bank, with the afternoon sun heavy and the main street noise of wagons and horses and the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons, Martha stopped and looked at him. "You did that on purpose," she said, saying nothing. "I said several things," Arthur said mildly. "You know what I mean. You let him look at you. You let him calculate." "A man like Dodd," Arthur said, "needs to understand the situation in his own way before he can respond to it." If I had led with the legal argument about the fraudulent note, he would have dug in. This way, he'll think tonight about what I might know and what I might be willing to do with it, and tomorrow he'll be considerably more interested in settling. Martha studied him. You have done this kind of thing before, she said. I've negotiated trail contracts, Arthur said. Cattle deals, grazing rights, it's not entirely different. He paused. Dodd is a bully of the financial kind. They all operate the same way. They count on the other party having less information and fewer options. What I'm doing is demonstrating that in this case, that's not true. He was right. On Thursday morning, Dodd sent a message to the hotel requesting a follow-up meeting, and by Thursday afternoon, he had agreed to settle the valid notes at face value and had, under the gentle pressure of Arthur's quiet statement that the district court in Topeka had a judge who took a particular interest in fraudulent instrument cases, agreed to void the third note entirely. The total settlement came to $710, which Arthur paid in cashier's draft, and which was documented with a written receipt clearing all claims against the Bailey property. Martha sat in Dodd's office while the papers were signed and watched Arthur Whitfield move through the transaction with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and she felt, beneath her relief and her gratitude and the complicated sorrow of the week she'd had, a warmth that she recognized and was not ready to look at directly. It took 2 days for the deed to be transferred into Martha Bailey's name alone, free and clear. She held the document in both hands in the land office and felt the paper between her fingers with something close to reverence. The land officer, a middle-aged man named Potts who had been recording land transactions in Caldwell for 6 years, looked at her face and then at Arthur Whitfield standing behind her and made the tactful decision to say nothing and simply notarize the document. That evening, Martha made dinner at the farmhouse and invited Arthur because it was the only thing she could think of to do that made sense, and he came, and they ate at the table where they had first looked at the loan documents together, and they talked. This time, there were no documents and no strategy. This time they just talked, and it was the kind of talking that Martha had not done in so long she had forgotten what it felt like, easy and wide-ranging, covering horses and cattle, and the particular challenge of Kansas winters, and what she had planted in the kitchen garden the previous spring, and how Arthur had got the scar on his left hand, which he said was from a cattle branding in 1878, and she believed him. The loan agreement, documented and witnessed by the hotel's proprietor, stipulated that Martha would repay Arthur at a rate of $30 per quarter year, without interest, beginning in 6 months. She had insisted on the terms herself, and he had accepted them without argument, though he had looked at her with an expression that suggested he thought the argument was worth having. You could simply accept it, he had said. I am accepting it, she had said. On my terms. He had looked at her for a long moment and then had said, yes, ma'am, and signed the document, and she had thought she saw that almost smile again at the corner of his mouth. On Friday morning, Arthur came to the farmhouse with his saddlebags packed and Pilgrim saddled and ready, because he had said he would stay a week, and the week was nearly up, and he had a ranch in Wichita that required his attention. He stood at the gate of the farmhouse fence, and Martha stood on the porch, and they looked at each other across the yard in the clear morning light. She was aware, standing there, that she did not want him to go. She was also aware that acknowledging this was more than her dignity could accommodate at the moment, so she said nothing of the kind. I'll send the first payment in 6 months, she said. By post. I'll be watching for it, he said. Your cousin's $30, she added. I'll include that as well, though the debt was not mine. Samuel will be surprised, Arthur said. He deserves it, Martha said. He was young and trustworthy, and my husband treated those as liabilities. He deserves the money back. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Mrs. Bailey, Martha, I know the timing is wrong, and I know you've been through a week that would break most people. I'm not going to say anything that wouldn't be appropriate to say, but I would like, if it's agreeable to you, to write. Not about the loan, just to write. Martha looked at him. She folded her hands in front of her in the way she had when she was thinking about something carefully. The cottonwood by the fence was putting out its first new leaves, small and pale green, trembling in the spring wind. "It would be agreeable," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, mounted Pilgrim in one easy motion that spoke of 10,000 hours in the saddle, and rode down the track toward town. He did not look back, which she respected, and she watched him until the track curved around the low hill and he was gone. She stood on the porch for a while after that, looking at nothing in particular, and then she went inside and picked up the deed to her land and held it in both hands again, and let herself, finally, feel something uncomplicated and good. The letters began 2 weeks after Arthur rode back to Wichita. His first letter arrived on a Tuesday in early May, carried by the post rider who came through Caldwell twice weekly. It was not a long letter, a single page in a clear, somewhat labored hand, but it was a precise and honest one. He wrote about the ranch, about a difficult foaling he had dealt with the week before, about the weather that was coming dry and how that would affect the spring cattle market. He did not write about feelings or sentiment. He wrote about the concrete facts of his days, and in doing so communicated something more than sentiment would have. Martha wrote back on the same day she received the letter, sitting at her kitchen table in the evening with the lamp lit and the sound of the Kansas wind against the windows. She wrote about the kitchen garden, which she was expanding. She wrote about the springs on the property and how they were running well this year. She wrote about Clem the horse, who had developed an abscess in his left hind hoof that she had treated herself, packing it with a poultice her mother had taught her, and about the fact that she had ridden to town to inquire about seasonal work at the dry goods store, because she needed additional income while the property got back on its feet. She had also, the day after Arthur left, gone to speak with her neighbor Frank Dahlin, who ran 120 head of cattle on the land north of hers, and whose fences occasionally intersected with her property line in ambiguous ways. She had gone to discuss the possibility of leasing her grazing land to Frank's cattle operation on a seasonal basis, which would generate income without requiring her to fully stock the land herself until she was ready. Frank had been surprised to see her approaching the subject with such directness. He had been even more surprised when she produced a draft agreement she had written herself, by hand, at her kitchen table the night before. He had laughed, not unkindly, and had said that she was not quite what he'd expected from a widow, and she had said that she suspected most widows were not quite what people expected, and they had shaken hands on a fair deal. The letters between Martha and Arthur Whitfield accumulated through May and into June. They became longer. They became more personal, not rapidly, not in the breathless way of people who throw open doors before they know what's on the other side, but steadily, the way a river builds volume in a season of good rain. Arthur wrote about his family, the Texas ranch his father had built from nothing, and that had passed to his older brother James when their father died, the mother who had lived until Arthur was 22, and who had been, by his account, a woman of considerable strength and very little patience for nonsense. He wrote about Samuel's new son, born in February, a healthy boy named Thomas. He wrote about the loneliness of ranching, which he acknowledged with a plainness that Martha found unexpectedly moving. She wrote back about her parents, who had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1866 and had homesteaded and had both died within 2 years of each other, her father of a lung illness and her mother of the grief that followed, and how at 22 she had been entirely alone in the world and had made the mistake of conflating loneliness with love. She wrote about what she had wanted her life to be: the land, the work, the growing of things, and what it had actually become under Eli's mismanagement. She wrote these things plainly, without melodrama, and they sat in the letters like the solid facts they were. In June, Arthur wrote to ask if he might come back to Caldwell for a few days. He had business with a cattle buyer in the area, he said, but he would also like to see how the property was coming along and whether the kitchen garden had done what she'd predicted. She wrote back one word of response and then crossed it out and wrote 3 sentences that amounted to the same thing, which was yes. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late June with Pilgrim and a pack mule loaded with something large and rectangular wrapped in canvas, and Martha came out to the porch and watched him come up the track with the afternoon light full on him, and felt the kind of thing in her chest that she had been carefully and deliberately not thinking about for 2 months. He tied the animals at the fence and came up and tipped his hat and said, "Mrs. Bailey," and she said, "Mr. Whitfield," and then they both stood there for a moment in that silence that is not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but that contains a tremendous amount of information. And then she said, "Come in then," and he came. He had brought, in the canvas wrap on the mule, a small cast-iron range, not new, but good, from a hardware store in Wichita, because he had mentioned in one of his letters that he had read she'd been cooking on a stove that was missing one of its cooking plates. It was a practical and thoughtful and entirely characteristic gift, and Martha looked at it for a moment with something very close to tears, which surprised and irritated her both. "That was not necessary," she said. "It was on my way," Arthur said, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it. He stayed 4 days. He helped her with the fence along the western boundary of the property, which had been falling since winter. He looked at the springs and confirmed what she already knew, that they were exceptional rare in Kansas, to have 2 reliable springs on 60 acres. He rode with her in the mornings when she checked the grazing land she was leasing to Frank Dolan, and in the evenings they sat on the porch after dinner in the cooling air and talked in the unhurried way that had characterized their letters, but was better in person because of the nuances available to speaking. The slight change of tone, the pause, the gesture. On the 3rd evening, they had been sitting in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sky shift through its extraordinary prairie colors, when Arthur said, without looking at her, "I'm going to say something." "All right," Martha said. "I'm not going to say it because the moment seems right," he said, "or because the sunset is doing something impressive, which it is, but I'll try not to hold that against myself. I'm going to say it because not saying it is becoming somewhat dishonest, and I would rather be honest with you than anything else." Martha set down the small piece of mending she had been working on. She looked at his profile in the evening light. "I think about you," Arthur said. "I have been thinking about you since last autumn in the saloon, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And I am aware that the timing of my arrival in your life was complicated, and that I came to you in a way that had everything in the world attached to it and very little of it simple. And I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know the truth of where I stand." The prairie spread out before them, amber and vast, and a nighthawk was hunting in the long light above the grass. "Arthur," Martha said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the formal address, and she felt the significance of that in the saying of it. "I have been a widow for 8 weeks. I was a wife before that for 3 years that were not good years. I do not know yet who I am when none of those things are true. I need time to find that out." "I know," he said, "but I am not asking you to stop writing," she said. He turned then and looked at her, and she looked back, and what passed between them in that looking was not a promise so much as an acknowledgment that something existed, that it was real, and that it was worth the patience required to let it develop properly. "All right," he said. He left on the morning of the 4th day, and this time she walked to the fence with him and stood while he loaded his saddle and checked Pilgrim's cinch, and when he was ready to mount he turned and looked at her and said, "6 months felt like a long time when I left in April. I don't expect it will feel that long now." "Probably not," she agreed. He rode down the track, and this time she thought she saw him glance back at the first bend, though she could not be entirely certain. She went back inside and began her day. Summer came in earnest to Caldwell, Kansas, the dry, crushing heat of a Kansas summer that turned the grass to gold and made the air above the road shimmer and sent the cattle into the shade of every available tree. Martha worked her property with a systematic energy that she recognized as the release of 3 years of frustrated capability. She expanded the kitchen garden and put up preserves and pickles and jellied things in the glass jars she bought at the dry goods. She repaired the smokehouse roof with materials she bargained for at the lumber yard. She mended the barn and cleaned out the grain room and made arrangements with a man named Prescott who came through twice monthly with a supply wagon to take her surplus eggs and honey, and preserved goods to sell in the market circuit that connected the small homesteads around Caldwell. She also, in the evenings, read. She had 4 books, a Bible, a natural history, a collection of poems that had been her mother's, and a thick volume of practical agricultural knowledge that she had found in Eli's trunk after his death, which he had never opened in 3 years of farming, and she was reading with the focused interest of someone who intended to use every word of it. Arthur's letters came twice monthly, regular as the seasons. They had grown longer and more thoughtful through the summer months, and she looked forward to them with a candor she no longer attempted to moderate in her own private feelings. She had told herself in April that she needed to understand who she was without the defining pressure of marriage or debt or desperation, and she was discovering, with some surprise, that who she was turned out to be someone she liked considerably. She was organized and capable and interested in a wide variety of things and genuinely funny, which she had not known about herself for several years. She had laughed more in the 4 months since Eli's death than in the 3 years before it, which was a fact she turned over in her mind occasionally with a complicated mixture of guilt and relief, and the sober understanding that some things were simply true. Arthur came back to Caldwell in September, not for 4 days this time but for a week, and this time he did not come with business as a pretext. He came for the sake of coming, which was its own kind of statement, and he made it openly, without pretense, in his August letter. He arrived looking somewhat better than he had in June rested, or as close to rested as a man who ran a ranch could manage. He had a new hat, she noticed, the same broad-brimmed style but darker and uncreased, just broken in. He said nothing about it and she said nothing about it, but she noticed. They fell into a companionable rhythm during that week that was different from June, more settled, more comfortable in the silences, more given to laughter. She discovered that Arthur had an extremely dry sense of humor that he deployed rarely and without warning, usually in the middle of a discussion about something entirely practical, and that he laughed with his whole face when something genuinely struck him as funny, which happened more than she expected. They rode together most mornings. The Kansas landscape in September was at its most beautiful, the grass going copper and the sky an impossible blue, and the air just beginning to carry the first edge of autumn, and they rode through it mostly in companionable silence, which was a particular kind of intimacy that Martha had come to value. One morning they rode out to the furthest corner of her property, where the second spring came up through a stand of cottonwood and willow at the base of a low limestone ridge. They dismounted and let the horses drink and stood in the shade with the light coming through the leaves in shifting patterns, and Martha looked at the spring and said, "I want to build something here." "What kind of something?" Arthur asked. "I don't know exactly. A small structure, a place to sit and work outside. This is the best water on the property and I've been using it for nothing but watering stock." Arthur looked at the spring and the ridge and the trees. "A spring house," he said. "Keep the water cool in summer. You could store butter and milk if you're going to expand the dairy operation." She had not been thinking of a spring house specifically, but it was the right idea immediately. She could see it, the low stone structure using the limestone from the ridge, the water channeled through it from the spring, cool and clean. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They designed it together right there, with a stick in the dirt, the placement, the dimensions, the channel. She drew and he revised and they argued productively about the angle of the roof, and the whole thing took perhaps 40 minutes and produced a design she was genuinely satisfied with. She looked up from the dirt diagram at one point and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen before, concentrated and warm and entirely unguarded. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Arthur said. "Only that you're very good at this, at drawing in dirt, At thinking, he said, at understanding how things fit together. She held his gaze for a moment. She had been careful, through April and May and June and July and August, through all the letters and the 4 days in June and now this September week, to maintain the careful distance she had set for herself, to acknowledge internally what she felt without acting on it or declaring it, to give herself and the situation the time she had said she needed. She was a practical woman, and she believed in the correctness of what she had decided. And she also knew, standing here in the dappled shade beside this particular spring, with the horses drinking, and the plans of a spring house drawn in the dirt between them, that the time she had needed was very close to having been sufficient. "Arthur," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "How long are you planning to keep the ranch in Wichita?" He was still for a moment. "That depends," he said carefully, "on a number of things." "What things?" He looked at her for a long, level moment. "Martha," he said, and the way he said her name, careful and complete, contained everything it needed to contain. "I would very much like to court you properly with whatever timeline makes sense to you. And if you are asking whether I would consider something other than Wichita as a base of operations, I am considering it. I have been considering it for some time." She took a breath of the clean September air and looked at the limestone ridge and the spring and the cottonwoods and her 60 acres of good land, free and clear and entirely hers. "Court me then," she said simply. "But I should tell you that I am not a woman who will be courted indefinitely. I know my own mind, and I will know it when I've made it up." "I know that about you," Arthur said, and that almost smile was fully present this time, genuine and warm, and she felt it in her chest like the first good warmth of a spring morning. They rode back to the farmhouse in the long September light, and that evening they had dinner by lamplight and talked until late. And when he left to ride back to the hotel in town, he paused at the gate and looked back at her on the porch with a look that said everything he had not yet put into words, and she stood in the warm dark and watched him go and felt, without qualification, happy. The courtship that followed was conducted with a thoroughness that suited both of them. Arthur extended his September visit by 3 more days, during which he began the preliminary work on the spring house, cutting and hauling limestone from the ridge with help from Frank Dolan's hired man, who was glad of the extra work. He wrote from Wichita in October to say he had begun making arrangements to transfer his interest in the Wichita ranch to his business partner, a man named Castillo, who had been running the operation capably for 2 years and who had long expressed interest in full ownership. Martha wrote back to say that 60 acres was not a large operation for a man who had managed cattle drives of 300 head, and that if he was going to make use of the land, he would need to think carefully about what kind of stock made sense for the property's resources. He wrote back to say he had thoughts about that, and would she be interested in discussing them when he came in November. She wrote back to say she had thoughts of her own, and that he should come prepared for a substantive conversation. He arrived in November with papers from the Wichita ranch transfer and a draft plan for a cattle operation scaled to 60 acres with expansion potential if adjoining land became available. She had a counterplan that she had developed over October, sitting at her kitchen table with the agricultural volume and a piece of graph paper she had bought from the dry goods. They spread both plans on the table beside each other and compared them with the serious, focused attention they brought to everything practical, and found, without much surprise, that the plans were broadly compatible and differed mainly in emphasis. They were sitting at the kitchen table over these plans on a November evening with the wind outside and the lamp between them when Arthur looked up from the documents and said, without any particular preamble, "Martha, will you marry me?" It was not a question in the way he said it, or rather, it was entirely a question, but it was said with the simplicity of a man who has thought about something very carefully and has decided that the time for equivocating is finished, and she appreciated the simplicity of it in the way she appreciated everything direct and unadorned. She looked at him across the lamplight. She had known for some time what her answer was. She had known since the morning by the spring in September and possibly before that. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding, and she thought with a rush of genuine tenderness that for all his steadiness and capability and calm, he had been nervous. That he had been sitting across from her at this table with the plans between them, and had not known for certain what she would say, which meant that all his patience and his respect for her process had been real and not assumed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight with the Kansas wind pressing against the windows, and the plans for their future spread on the table between them. They were married in the Caldwell Church on a Saturday in January of 1883, in a ceremony officiated by Reverend Haskins, who was considerably more animated at this event than he had been at Eli Bailey's burial 8 months prior. The church was not full. Martha's circle of genuine acquaintance in Caldwell was small, but the people who were there were the right ones. Frank Dolan and his wife Clara came, and the Prescott family from the supply circuit, and the land office clerk Potts and his wife, and the woman who ran the dry goods, a sharp-eyed widow named Agnes Hale who had shown Martha particular kindness in the difficult weeks after Eli's death, and who wore her best dress and cried in the dignified way of women who are happy about things. Arthur's cousin Samuel came from the Texas Hill Country with his wife Petra and their infant son Thomas, having traveled 3 days to be present, which said everything that needed saying about Samuel Greer's character. He was a young man of perhaps 22, sandy-haired and open-faced, and he shook Martha's hand at the reception dinner at the hotel with a directness that reminded her of Arthur and said, simply, "I'm glad he found you." "So am I," Martha said. Samuel returned the $30 she had sent him in the summer, pressing it back into her hand, and saying that it had been the most unnecessary thing she could have done, and that he wanted her to put it toward the spring house, and she kept it only after he made clear he would be offended if she refused. They honeymooned in the modest way available to people who had a ranch to get running by spring, 3 days in a hotel in Wichita, which was as much as the season would allow, but which were 3 of the finest days Martha could remember. They walked through Wichita in the January cold and visited the ranch Arthur was in the process of transferring and met Castillo, a broad-shouldered man of about 40 who shook Martha's hand and told her that Arthur had not shut up about her for 3 months, which Arthur bore with considerable equanimity. They returned to the Caldwell farmhouse, which had in the intervening months been significantly improved, the new range installed, and a second room added to the back with lumber Arthur had freighted from Wichita in October, and they began their life. It was not a simple life. Ranching in Kansas in the 1880s was hard and unforgiving work, and they did it together without any pretense that it would be otherwise. They stocked the property with 30 head of cattle in the spring of 1883, which was the number the land and the 2 springs could reasonably support, and they worked the herd through the seasons with the focused efficiency of 2 people who understood each other's, thinking well enough to divide the labor without extended negotiation. Martha's loan repayments went back to Arthur's Wichita account, which he had designated as a property improvement fund, and by the 2nd year she had renegotiated the terms of the loan with herself, if not with him, since he consistently maintained the money had no bearing on their arrangement, and had paid the full amount by the end of 1884, which she marked in the household ledger with a satisfaction that was entirely personal. She ran the household accounts and the supply operation and the seasonal grazing agreements with Frank Dolan's expanded outfit, and she tended the spring house, which was completed in the summer of 1883 by Arthur and Frank Dolan's hired man, and which worked exactly as they had designed it by the spring in September of 1882, keeping the dairy stores cool through the Kansas summer heat. She also corresponded, as the years went on, with several other women in the area on the practical questions of land management and livestock health, and the navigation of the financial institutions that generally regarded women landowners as anomalies to be tolerated rather than clients to be served. She had learned a considerable amount during the business with Harlan Dodd about how such institutions operated and where their vulnerabilities lay, and she found that this knowledge was useful to other women in similar positions, and she shared it freely. Harlan Dodd, for his part, had suffered a considerable reduction in his civic standing in the 18 months following the settlement of the Bailey notes, when it emerged through channels that were never quite attributable that his acceptance of a fraudulent instrument was not an isolated incident, but a practice he had applied to several properties he was interested in acquiring. The district court in Topeka did eventually take an interest, and Dodd reached a financial settlement with the territory that cost him considerably more than the discounted settlement he had made with Arthur and Martha, and his name on the Cattlemen's Bank sign was replaced by a new partner's name before the end of 1884. Martha noted this development in her household journal with 2 sentences and no further comment, which seemed sufficient. In the spring of 1884, Martha discovered she was expecting, which she reported to Arthur with a plainness that matched his own characteristic approach to important information. Directly, over breakfast, with the calculation already done about the timing and the things that would need to be arranged. He sat across the table from her and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had seen before on his face, that quality of complete unguardedness, and then he got up from the table and came around to her and put his hands on her shoulders and said, "Are you well?" "Quite well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine." He pressed his forehead briefly to the top of her head, and she put her hand over his on her shoulder, and they stayed like that for a moment while the morning light came through the kitchen window, and the sound of Caldwell waking up drifted in from the distance. Their son was born in October of 1884. He was a solid, loud, very alert baby who arrived in a difficult labor attended by the local midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Arroyo, who had delivered perhaps 200 babies in Caldwell and its surrounds, and who told Arthur, waiting in the main room with a remarkable lack of composure for a man generally characterized by steadiness, that everything was proceeding normally and that he ought to sit down before he fell down. He was named James Thomas Whitfield, James for Arthur's older brother in Texas and Thomas for Samuel's boy, and he had Arthur's dark eyes and Martha's auburn hair, and from his earliest weeks an extremely definite personality that suggested he had opinions and was not going to wait long to express them. Samuel and Petra came north from Texas to see the baby in November, and Samuel's Thomas, now nearly 2, investigated the Whitfield farmhouse with the comprehensive curiosity of a toddler, while the adults sat around the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked in the easy, multi-threaded way of people who know each other well enough to carry 3 conversations simultaneously. "He looks like you," Samuel told Arthur, looking at James in his cradle. "He looks like his mother," Arthur said. "He looks like both of you," Petra said, with the decisive authority of a woman who had just gone through this process herself, and therefore had standing to rule on the question. The years moved with the steady pace of seasons on working land. James grew from infant to toddler to boy with the speed that parents consistently find astonishing, and that children find entirely appropriate. He had his father's deliberateness of manner and his mother's quickness of thought, and he combined them in ways that were sometimes exhausting and generally delightful. In 1886, the grazing land adjacent to their northern boundary came available when its owner, an aging bachelor homesteader named Grantley, decided to sell and move to live with his daughter in Missouri. Martha saw the listing in the land office 2 days before it was otherwise publicly available. She had maintained a good relationship with Potts over the years, and she and Arthur made an offer that same day. The land was 40 additional acres of good grass with seasonal water and a small barn in reasonable condition, and they acquired it at a fair price and expanded the herd accordingly. By 1887, they ran 70 head on 100 acres, with the springhouse operating at full capacity and the kitchen garden providing a surplus that Martha sold through an expanded arrangement with the Caldwell General Store. The household ledger, which Martha maintained with a precision that would have satisfied a bank examiner, showed them solidly in the black, which was a condition she intended to maintain in perpetuity. She was 31 years old. Arthur was 36. James was 3 and beginning to have opinions about horses. On an evening in March of 1887, they sat on the porch in the mild early spring air after James had been put to bed, and the Kansas sky was doing its extraordinary thing with the last colors of sunset, and Martha leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder in the way she had come to do, comfortable and entirely natural, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet for a while. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me at Eli's grave, that you had come to make it right?" "I remember," Arthur said. "Did you know then," she asked, "what making it right would actually look like?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the particular quality of his thinking through the silence. "No," he said. "I thought it would look like settling a debt, clearing a note, possibly finding you a lawyer or connecting you with someone who could help with the legal question." He paused. "I did not think it would look like this." "Like what?" she asked, though she knew. He tightened his arm around her slightly. "Like this," he said simply. She laughed softly. The nighthawk was out again, hunting in the dark above the grass the way it always was this time of year, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky over the cottonwoods. "I was so angry that morning," she said. "Not at you, at everything. At Eli, at the bank, at 3 years of being someone's wife without being anyone's partner. And then you appeared and I had absolutely no idea what to do with you." "You did well enough," Arthur said. "You looked me over like you were deciding whether I was worth the time, which I respected." "I was deciding exactly that," Martha said. And you were," she said, "as it turned out." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. That brief and characteristic gesture that she had come to understand was his version of everything the poets wrote volumes about, all of it compressed into a moment of contact that was unpretentious and entirely genuine. "Arthur," she said. "Yes. James is going to need a horse of his own within 2 years." He laughed, that genuine, full-face laugh. "He's 3 years old." "He is an extremely determined 3 years old," Martha said. "I have watched him at the fence looking at the horses. He has decided." "He has your gift for deciding things," Arthur said. "He has your stubbornness." "Those may be the same trait," Arthur said. "They may be," Martha agreed. They stayed on the porch as the dark came full on, and the stars multiplied across the Kansas sky in their astonishing quantity, and the coyotes began their distant conversation somewhere to the south, and the springs ran quiet in the dark, and the cattle were settled, and the house behind them was solid and real and theirs. In the summer of 1888, Martha found she was expecting again, and in February of 1889 their daughter was born, a girl they named Clara Ruth Whitfield, Clara for Frank Dahlon's wife, who had been a steady and practical friend through the years, and Ruth for Martha's mother. Clara was quieter than James from the start, which was a relative measure since James was not quiet, and she arrived in the world with her mother's auburn hair and the particular expression of calm assessment that was, Arthur said, entirely her own and unlike either of them, which Martha thought was perhaps the finest thing a child could manage. James, who was 4½ and had views on most subjects, examined his new sister with the serious attention of someone performing a quality inspection, and then announced that she seemed all right, and that he would teach her to ride when she was old enough. Martha told him that Clara might have her own ideas about that. James considered this and said that she probably would, which showed a degree of self-awareness that Martha hoped he would maintain. Arthur's brother James and his family came from Texas in the spring of 1889 to see the ranch and meet the children, a visit that had been planned and delayed 3 times by the demands of their respective operations, and that when it finally happened filled the small farmhouse with a cheerful noise that made it feel twice as large as it was. James Whitfield Sr. was an older, somewhat harder version of Arthur, with the same dark eyes and considerably more words, and his wife Catherine had the sharp intelligence and the exhausted patience of a woman who had been managing a Texas ranch and 3 children for 15 years, and she and Martha understood each other within approximately 20 minutes of meeting. "He talked about you in letters for a year before he married you," Catherine told Martha on their second day, sitting in the kitchen while the men looked at the cattle and the older children ran outside and Clara slept. "James would read them to me and say that Arthur had finally lost his mind because no sensible man goes to a widow's husband's funeral and offers to settle her debts." "He did not go to the funeral," Martha said precisely. "He went to the grave." "That's worse," Catherine said and laughed. "But here you are, and it appears he had more sense than James gave him credit for." "I believe the debt was real to him," Martha said. "The debt to Samuel. And he is a man who does not leave things unfinished." "No," Catherine agreed. "He's not. He's been that way since he was a boy." Drove their mother absolutely to distraction, because once he decided a thing was right to do, there was no amount of inconvenience that would stop him. She looked at Martha with a directness that Martha appreciated. "He's happy. I don't think I've seen him happy in the way he's happy now. Not before you." Martha looked down at her coffee cup. She thought about the grave in the Cottonwood Cemetery, and the stranger with his hat in his hands and the plain pine marker and the $43 and the fraudulent note, and the conversation over coffee and the plans in the dirt by the spring and the lamplight in November and the word yes, which was the simplest and most consequential thing she had ever said. "Nor have I," she said. "Not before him." By 1890, Caldwell had changed considerably. The cattle trade was shifting. The great trail drives north from Texas were diminishing as the railroads pushed further south and the western ranges were fenced in, and the town was becoming more settled, more domestic, less wild. The saloons were still there, but the stockyards were quieter, and the land around the town was filling in with homesteads and small farms, and the character of the place was becoming something more like permanence. Martha and Arthur Whitfield's property was one of the more established in the area, by then 100 acres of good working land, well watered, with a solid house that had been expanded twice, a proper barn, the spring house, a smoke house, a kitchen garden that was closer to a kitchen farm, and a growing reputation for producing cattle that were well conditioned and reliably healthy. Arthur had begun consulting informally for other small ranchers in the area on matters of herd management and grazing rotation, the kind of practical expertise that did not get written down but that passed between people doing the same work in the same landscape. And Martha had begun, almost without deciding to do so, something that could only be described as a community lending operation. Not a formal institution, but a private arrangement by which she connected women in difficult financial circumstances with resources and information, and occasionally, with the kind of legal knowledge that came from having once navigated a fraudulent bank note to a successful conclusion. She was not a lawyer, and she was careful to say so. She was a woman who had been in a specific situation and had found a way out of it and was willing to share what she had learned. That was all she offered, and that turned out to be precisely what was needed. Agnes Hale, the dry goods owner, told her once that she had become something of a legend in the women's network that connected the homesteads around Caldwell, which Martha received with the skepticism she applied to most things said about herself. "I am not a legend," Martha said. "I am a woman who paid attention." "That is what all legends think," Agnes said. James Whitfield, who was 6 in 1890, had his horse, a small gray mare named Pearl that Arthur had found and selected with great care, something between 14 and 15 hands, good-tempered and sound, that James immediately loved with the wholehearted unself-consciousness of childhood. He rode with his father in the mornings with a seriousness of purpose that was recognizable in its origin, and he told anyone who would listen that he was going to have 100 horses when he grew up, which Arthur said was an interesting ambition, and Martha said was going to require significantly more land. Clara, at a year and a half, was beginning to walk with considerable determination, and a directness of trajectory that suggested she intended to go where she intended to go and was not interested in obstacles. She had developed a particular attachment to the kitchen garden, which Martha took as a good sign, and she would stand at the fence of the garden patch and point at things with authority, which Martha found both amusing and entirely familiar. On an afternoon in the late autumn of 1890, Martha walked up the low hill to the Cottonwood Cemetery above town. She went alone, as she had in April of 1882, though everything else about the two visits was different. She wore a practical work dress, not morning clothes. She walked with the easy stride of someone who was comfortable in her own skin and her own life. She was 34 years old. She stood at Eli Bailey's grave, which had a proper stone now. She had ordered it put up in 1883, not from sentiment but from the practical belief that a grave without a marker was untidy. It said simply, Eli Bailey, 1850–1882. She had not added anything else. There did not seem to be anything else that was both true and appropriate. She stood there for a while, not in grief, not in anger. She had worked through both of those things in the years since, in the honest and unglamorous way that the working through of difficult feelings actually happens, incrementally and without ceremony, in the middle of ordinary days. She stood there because she believed in acknowledging things that were real, and Eli Bailey had been real, and the 3 years she had spent married to him had been real, and they had shaped her in ways she could not have been shaped otherwise, including making her someone who could stand at a cemetery gate in April of 1882 and look at a stranger with steady eyes and decide whether he was worth the time. "I have had a good life since you," she said to the stone, not unkindly. "I am going to have more good life. I thought you should know." She stayed a few minutes longer and then turned and walked back down the hill into the sound of Caldwell going about its business, and the smell of the smoke from the chimneys, and the particular clarity of a November afternoon in Kansas, and she thought about dinner, and whether James had done his school reading, and how Clara's tooth was coming in, and what Arthur would think of the idea she had about relocating the water trough in the north pasture, and about the evening ahead with the lamp lit, and the good solid life that waited for her at the end of the track. Arthur was at the barn when she got home, working on a piece of tack that needed restitching, and he looked up when she came into the yard and took in her face with that particular attention he had always given her. "You went up to the cemetery," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," she said. He waited. "I'm ready for dinner," she said, "and I have an idea about the north pasture water trough." He set down the tack. "Tell me," he said. She did, walking beside him toward the house in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that made everything in Kansas look like it had been painted with gold, and James came running from the direction of Pearl's paddock and wrapped around her waist in the careless full-body embrace of a 6-year-old, and Clara was inside with the woman who came to help 3 afternoons a week, and the house was warm and lit, and Arthur held the door for her as she went in, and she put her hand on his arm as she passed. Briefly, the way she did, and he covered her hand with his for a moment, and none of it was dramatic or large, and all of it was everything. She set James's school reader on the table and told him he would finish the reading after dinner. She washed her hands at the basin. She looked out the kitchen window at the long Kansas twilight spreading over the grass and the good water of her springs glinting in the last light. Arthur came in behind her and stood at the window beside her, and they looked out together at the land that was theirs, free and clear and paid for and real. "I was thinking," he said, "that in the spring we ought to look at that piece on the eastern boundary. Tompkins mentioned he might be willing to talk." 20 more acres, Martha said. Good grass, Arthur said. Good water too, Martha said. The creek runs along that eastern line. It does, Arthur agreed. She turned from the window. James was at the table with his reader actually reading, which was a small miracle worth acknowledging. Clara was in the front room with the cheerful, concentrated sound of a child engaged with objects. The stove was warming. "Then we'll talk to Tompkins in the spring," she said, and went to start dinner. The years continued to lay themselves down in the steady, unhurried way of years lived fully. Their household grew and deepened. Their land expanded one careful piece at a time. Their cattle herd settled into a sustainable rhythm of 70 to 90 head, depending on the season and the grass. Their children grew into themselves. James, precise and horse-devoted and possessed of his mother's capacity for decisive action, and Clara, calm and observant and possessed of something that was entirely her own, a quality of patience that in a 12-year-old was either remarkable or unnerving, depending on who you asked. They celebrated each winter with the Dahlin family at Christmas, a tradition that had begun in their second year and had become as fixed as the seasons themselves. They rode to church on Sundays in the wagon with the children, which was a commitment they maintained through rain and frost, and the particular Kansas wind that would strip the hat from your head if you gave it the chance. They argued occasionally, in the productive way of two people who both have strong opinions and the intelligence to know when they are wrong, and they resolved those arguments with the same directness they brought to everything: plain speaking, genuine listening, and the practical business of finding the better path, which was generally a combination of both their views and occasionally, grudgingly, a third view neither had initially considered. In the summer of 1893, a drought came that was the hardest in Kansas in many years, and the grass went dry, and the springs ran lower than Martha had ever seen them, and the cattle lost condition, and several of the smaller operations around Caldwell suffered badly. The Whitfield ranch lost 18 head and went through a difficult season, and Martha watched the ledger with a close and careful eye and made adjustments and stretched resources and did not panic, because she had learned in 1882 what real financial danger looked like, and this, while serious, was not that. They came through it. Most of the ranches and farms in the area that had been properly managed and had not overextended in the good years came through it, and the ones that had not, and Martha spent considerable time in 1893 and 1894, applying what she had learned about bank notes and fraudulent instruments and the rights of landowners to several situations that echoed, uncomfortably, the one she had been in herself 11 years before. Harlan Dodd was long gone from Caldwell, but the structures that had allowed him to operate were not, and the drought had created new opportunities for the same kind of predation. She did not always win. There were situations where the legal and financial entrapment was too complete, and the resources available too limited, and the outcome was loss of land that should not have been lost. And she sat with the women in those situations and was honest about what she could and could not do, and tried to help them navigate what came next. It was not comfortable work and it was not always rewarding, but it was, she believed, necessary. Arthur helped when she asked him and did not insert himself when she did not, which was precisely the right approach and something she appreciated in him still, after 11 years, as much as she had appreciated it standing in a cemetery in April of 1882. In 1895, James was 11 and Clara was 6, and the Whitfield Ranch was 120 acres of good working land with a solid house, and a productive operation, and a household account that was entirely in the black and a spring that still ran clear even through the worst Kansas summers. And Arthur and Martha Whitfield sat on their porch on a September evening and looked at what they had built and were quiet with the satisfaction of it. "Samuel's Thomas is riding his first drive this year," Arthur said. He had received a letter that week from Samuel, who was now in his mid-30s and running a solid ranch in Texas with Petra and 4 children, of whom Thomas was the eldest. "He's what, 13?" Martha asked. "14," Arthur said. "Petra says he's more competent than Samuel was at 20, which she says with love." "I believe it," Martha said. "He has his father's reliability." The evening deepened. The nighthawk was out. It was always out in September, and Martha had come to feel about it as she felt about the springs and the cottonwoods as part of the specific texture of this place. This life, which was hers in a way that nothing before it had been, not because she had inherited it or married into it or been given it, but because she had stood in a cemetery and assessed a stranger and said yes at the right moment to the right things and had worked with her whole self for every year of it since. "Arthur," she said. He said, "I want to tell you something." He turned to look at her. After 13 years of marriage, he still turned to look at her when she spoke to him, which was not nothing. "When you said that morning that you had come to make it right," she said, "I thought it was about the money, the notes, the debt. I thought that was what you meant by right." "I know," he said, "and you did make that right," she said. "You settled the notes and got the deed transferred and took Harlan Dodd apart in his own office, quietly and without any drama, and that was all genuinely important, and I am grateful for it still." "But," he said, "but that was not what you made right," she said. "What you made right was something I had not known was wrong. I thought I understood what a life was supposed to be, what a marriage was supposed to be, and I had been given a version of those things that was so far from the real shape that I had almost forgotten there was a real shape. You came to that grave in the morning and you showed me, not by anything you said at first, just by standing there with your hat in your hands and waiting to see if I was ready to hear you, that something different was possible. That is what you made right." He was quiet for a long time. The stars were well up now, thick across the Kansas sky. "Martha," he said, and there was in the way he said it everything that had been there since the beginning, since the lamplight and the documents and the dirt diagram by the spring and the November evening in 1882 when she had said yes across a kitchen table, all of it present and still alive, unchanged by the ordinary days that were, she had come to understand, not ordinary at all. "I know," she said, because she did. He took her hand in his, and they sat with the stars above them and the sound of the land around them. And James's lamp was on in his room where he was reading something to do with horses, and Clara was asleep, and the springs ran in the dark, and the cattle were quiet, and the cottonwoods moved in the night air, and the life they had built together from nothing more than a debt and a grave and a stranger standing with his hat in his hands on an April morning. This complete, solid, irreplaceable life spread out around them in every direction, as far as they could see, which in Kansas on a clear night in September was a very long way indeed. In the years that followed, they would look back on that evening sometimes, not with nostalgia so much as with the particular satisfaction of people who have built something real and know its value. James would grow into a young man who knew horses better than almost anyone in the county, and who, at 20, rode his first cattle drive south and came back with the look of someone who had confirmed something about himself he'd already known. Clara would grow into a woman of extraordinary capability and the same calm authority she'd had since childhood, who would do things with the land and with the community around it that neither of her parents had fully anticipated, though both of them, looking at her, found that they should have. They would have more good years and some hard ones, and they would face those years with the same thing they had brought to all the others, the combination of practical intelligence and honest communication and the enduring particular fact of them, Arthur and Martha Whitfield, who had found each other at a grave and had chosen, every day since, to stay. The land was theirs. The springs ran clear. The children grew. And on the hill above Caldwell, the Cottonwood Cemetery stood with its fence and its markers and its plain pine and its stone, and the grass grew green over what was buried there, which was what grass always did, and what the living always counted on.